All right, everybody, welcome back. This is The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and today we are talking about the Bronze Age collapse, one of the truly apocalyptic events from history that flies under the radar sometimes, but I think in recent years has been getting a little bit more attention.
A little more play.
Yeah, it's a little bit more
Is the Bronze Age collapse having its moment?
yeah, exactly. Um, but before we talk about that, I thought we would just kind of follow up on our last episode, which was geared towards contemporary political events. And Biden's still in it to win it, as we know. No movement on that, despite some pretty consistent pressure, I would say, for him to drop out.
Yeah. Although I think his strategy is not the worst one,
No, it's
right?
kind of, I think it's kind of working. I'm feeling like the political weather vane is like it was sort of like listing in the wind, and now it's kind of pointing back
Well,
towards Biden in a
yeah, like
way.
it would be hard to give him too much credit for anything, at the current moment, good or
Sure.
bad, perhaps. But I will say that it kind of just seems like him and his team are making a bet that people who never take real and risky action will continue to not do that. And so like you get these like amazing moments where it's like where he actually does seem lucid, where he's like, okay, challenge me at a convention then. Go
Yeah.
ahead. Like
Yeah,
to see you guys pull that off.
I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, where yeah, what has marked the Democrats above all else is a
Yeah,
kind of careening moderation.
that's right. That's right.
Like just oh my God, like healthcare for all. No, we must stay away from this like utterly crazed position or
Yeah.
whatever, and instead, offer debt forgiveness for small business owners who successfully run a small business in a marginalized community for three
Right.
years.
Right.
Pell Grant forgiveness. I think that was like Harris's like big.
That was them
Ra-
like pushing all their chips in.
that was just yeah, that was just like full radicalism
But like
from
that's the edge, right? Is that ultimately I'm not sure in not to be too fair to Biden. I'm just not sure how many people in his position would actually cede power and create all of the problems that would be created over the next year. Whatever he seems to think that his legacy would be. I just don't know how many actual Democrats would take this actual step if they were in the same situation. And I think also with Biden, the great thing for him is all he really has to do is make it complicated enough that real action would have to take place. And we'll
yeah.
see. And maybe it will. And maybe he's him and his team are basically like, all right, if something else really fucked up happens, I guess we're out. But there's no real reason for us to, dig our own grave, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the funny thing is they keep going back to like if we replace Biden, your votes are being ignored.
Oh, I love that
You
too.
because it's like, oh yeah, because there was such a meaningful primary.
I for one was so engaged during this year's primary. Spoiled for choice as we were.
Yeah, it's
Well, you see, just before we recorded that AOC came out uh, unequivocal in her support of the Biden campaign, saying Biden is going to be the nominee and I support him. So,
yeah, and I think that's not surprising. I think the ironically the pressure for Biden to drop out has come from the center, not from the left, right? I mean, we've seen Maureen Dowd, Tom Friedman, Nick
mhm.
Kristof, New York Times editorial board, Boston Globe editorial, like all these very centrist uh, media groups kind of pushing for Biden to drop out. And then there was the like Mark Warner, Mark Warner, not exactly Trotsky, right? Was like they were gonna have this meeting with Biden today, but that was called off over the weekend. I'm not entirely
Yeah.
sure what that's all
It's
about.
funny because you think that the initial strategy, the initial hope was that it would die down, and then it didn't die down, but then they still stayed the course. It's
Yeah.
like it's this incredible confluence. I think, not just AOC, but I think people in the Democratic Party who are coming out in support of him, honestly, I my guess is somewhere in there is the calculus that the election was already maybe cooked. The swing states were looking pretty bad. The chances of actually winning, no matter who ran, were decreasing. And now, nothing a Democrat loves more than another thing they can blame for failure.
Well, right. I mean, they're already gearing up to blame the Bernie Bros again somehow.
Yeah, but this is, I mean, we'll talk about a couple
Bernie
other things
also
because
very firmly behind Biden, dismissed any chance of him stepping in. Although it's funny that someone asked him about this on one of the Sunday shows, and he like didn't dignify it with a response. So of course, the pundits were like, he's running, but he was instead like, no, I'm running for Senate. I'm running for re-election. That's it. I don't want to talk about
right.
any other,
Right.
and
And
Bernie.
I think there's a pretty basic calculus going on, which is that I don't think people like Bernie, who have had plenty experience with this party totally botching anything remotely complicated, or again risky, and just not trusting that side of the party either. I mean, never mind not trusting Biden's team, to be honest about
Oh
its
yeah,
condition. Why
yeah.
would you trust any of these people to be able to do this in a way that would actually lead to a victory?
Yeah, no, I think
But
that's
yeah, just to finish up the quick little recap, it's been quite the frenetic week in Western European politics, right? You want to
well,
talk
yeah,
about?
let's talk about the UK first. So the UK had
Sure.
their election on the 4th of July. Odd
Hmm.
choice, but God bless.
Real kick in the
And
balls. Real kick in the balls.
Labour, as expected, did sweep into power, albeit with many fewer votes than Corbyn received in 2017.
Interesting, Stu. It's not being portrayed as such in the post-mortem. Ironically, they are talking about vote shares, right? A lot,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and whether this rather antiquated system that they have is effective in sort of reflecting the will of the people, but also never mentioning that Corbyn was on the other side of the when it was his turn. And I dig some joy out of Corbyn winning his seat as an independent. So that
oh
should be
yeah. I mean, that was like the only like inspiring thing to happen in like the whole thing. I mean, there were a few other pretty good things. A lot of like a couple other independents and Green Party members were also elected. Of course,
Mhm.
that's counterbalanced with reform finally, which is Nigel Farage finally entering the House of Parliament, right?
Yeah, thank
Or
God.
is it the
It's been
Houses
too
of
long.
Parliament?
It's been too long.
Well, he's been trying for like 25
Yeah.
years, right? But and UKIP is no more, but his Reform Party lives on, and has come under fire a little bit
Yeah, and
in
I think let's
recent
talk about that
days.
briefly because I think that really does tie into this
Oh
this
yeah.
podcast. Why don't you why don't
So
you why don't you tell people what we found here?
all right, so I saw this trending on Twitter and I sent it to Michael immediately. Here's a headline from the Guardian. Reform UK under pressure to prove all its candidates were real people.
And of course,
And
they're reform candidates, so you have to actually read the article to realize what they're talking about, because they could just be talking about the actual people in a certain sense.
well,
Like
I mean,
reform
some of them
UK under pressure to prove all of its candidates were. Are these people even real?
yeah, it's not just like, are they for real?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like
that's right.
literally, are they AI generated simulacra
Hmm.
of humans?
Yeah,
And the article kind of centers on this one guy called Mark Matlock.
yeah.
And a podcast is an audio medium, but just looking at the campaign photo of him, it's at best severely photoshopped, almost to like an
Yeah.
airbrushed extent.
Although the
Eh,
Brits have had some recent experience with this, with the
Uh,
Middleton.
Oh yeah. Well, let's sore spot for this podcast, but never mind. But it also just looks like it was possibly done with Stable Diffusion or one of the AI image generators. Like he almost looks, he has
Yeah.
that uncanny valley-esque appearance of like from a distance you're like, oh yeah, that's a guy, and then you look a little closer, you're like, wait a minute, like
Yeah, he almost looks like a Sims character. I mean, and
yeah.
the thing that really hammers it home, the beauty of a party like Reform, right, is that like this guy looks like a Reform candidate
Oh
to a
yeah.
degree that is so disturbing that you're like, maybe this just can't be real, you know?
And some of the other candidates for some of the boroughs were ridiculous. Like there was one guy, I forget what seat he was running for, but he lived in Gibraltar and was
Mhm.
running for a seat that was, outside London or whatever. It's like, oh, that's only 600 miles away from his constituency or
Right.
whatever.
But it's a little complicated because of the rules and because of like the way that they, you know, gain whatever advantage they gain from vote share, that there are at times in these elections, not just in the UK, there are what are called paper candidates who
Oh
don't
yeah.
really do any actual campaigning.
In
Um,
Canada too, right? I
well, in
mean,
Canada, one of the times that this kind of took place, right, was under the big the Jack Layton wave election. I don't know if you recall this, but the NDP under Layton, who was a rather charismatic leader, sort of a Corbyn Bernie figure,
uh-huh.
in Canada, and the NDP took advantage of a lot of various political wins to sort of overperform or close hard. And one of these areas was also Quebec, where they weren't traditionally winning seats, and some of the candidates it turned out were like woefully underqualified. I think if I remember correctly, there was one was just like a bartender who wasn't running, who was just like asked to sign up,
They just
sort
put
of
his
thing.
name on the ballot or
But
whatever.
then instead of just like getting some votes,
He won.
won, right? He or she, I can't remember the exact details, but usually these people are just thrown up so that you can say at things like a debate or at a campaign stop, like we have candidates in every riding, to try to sort of
Yeah,
build
yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
party.
And they
But it
also,
also it also makes you wonder, like, where does this end? You do have some people who are pro AI government, right? Like that the AI itself should take over democracy. And in
it
fact,
seems like an incredibly bad idea based on
yeah,
everything I know about AI.
right. But I mean, if you think about the total stagnation of political language that exists in our society, it wouldn't be
Oh,
too hard to train an AI to just get up and just blow Biden out of the water in a debate, right?
yeah. Well, that's what an accomplishment. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't foresee our first AI president in my lifetime, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, but it's sort of one of their philosophical points, right? Is that you could theoretically like input all of the actual desires and goals of the people into a candidate who would then spit out his policy plank and
It
his
would be like a
speeches.
pure feedback mechanism with like
Right,
no,
right.
it would just be like the candidate would become a pure product of the feedback of the constituents.
Right.
But of course, there are contradictory elements in what
Right.
constituents
Interesting.
want. I'm
Yeah.
sure that wouldn't cause the AI to go haywire. But lastly, let's just talk briefly about France, where
Yeah.
signs were all pointing towards Marine Le Pen finally taking not taking power, but becoming the head of the majoritarian party. There
Hmm.
was talk that they were going to get an outright majority
Yeah.
in the French representative body, and that did not happen. And in fact, her party was third after the left under Mélenchon, which won the most seats, not an outright
Hmm.
majority. And then the Macronist centrist party was second, and the Marine Le Pen party was third. And circulating on Twitter, as I'm sure you've seen, excuse me, on X.com, X, the everything app, um, are all these videos of these young
Oh,
thug conservative like
so
business
amazing.
type freaks waiting for the results and then just seeing them and being like, Sacre bleu.
I mean,
Ooh
it
la
was
la.
it was truly like the the best possible version of like the clips when your favorite team like wins a title and the next day like the Celtics like beat the Lakers. You'll have
And you
like the
see
Laker
the
fans
Laker
breaking the
fans like,
TVs,
yeah,
and then you see like the Boston fans going crazy. And like
and
those are the other clips
also
that were
breaking
so
TVs, but just in
sure,
shops
sure.
instead of
Yeah,
in
yeah, yeah. That's
their
right.
homes and bars or whatever. Yeah.
But those were my favorite clips. Were not the ones
No,
of the far
it
right
was the
party.
young people being happy. Yeah.
I mean, it's such a rare thing. You know, it makes you just be like, I wish for once, you know, somewhere where I live could experience such a moment. You know, and obviously it's not a
Well, I
cure
mean,
all,
we
but
sort of did when Obama was elected. Maybe you weren't here yet.
I mean, I didn't
Did you live in New
feel
York? You didn't live in New York for
no. I
Obama's
moved down
election.
in '09.
Okay.
But I didn't.
I did. I mean, I was teaching at City College at the time, and I took
Hmm,
a train to meet some friends down by Union Square to watch the results. I was actually teaching a class that was like writing in the 2008 presidential election. So we had like a little watch party with our class. And
yeah,
then I went to my party and we all went to Union Square afterwards. And there was like a real like French
energy. Yeah,
Revolutionary
I remember
energy.
being very
Of
excited.
course, that all was for naught.
Yeah, I remember being very excited, but I think like now, all of these years later, it would take me something like what happened in France to actually
Right.
get a little bit
Where you
moved.
actually,
And
well,
also
yeah.
there's a couple of very interesting elements at play there, right? One is, of course, the trying to recalibrate when the left gains any type of foothold to instantly praising Macron for his gamble, right? It's like, you know,
Well, and the New York
anything
Times being like, now that the left has won, like
yeah,
concerns are
concerns are emerging
and then
that
you
good
like
things may happen.
over their platform, and their
Right.
platform is like
Lower the
reduce
retirement
retirement
age.
age. Yeah, like really
But
evil,
you know,
just
they
outright evil
did
stuff.
like again, I think that the left deserves all the credit in the world, but it's interesting to note the similarities here, right? Not that there is anything like the coherent left in electoral politics in this country that there is
No,
in France. But it is interesting to note that what did turn the tide was not just this fear that really rallied and ratcheted people up in
no, it
the
was a
weeks
party that
before.
was offering something instead of
Well,
just,
and
hey, we're
but
not that guy.
right, but there was this coalition of withdrawing candidates on both sides, the Macron side and the Mélenchon's party, right,
Yeah,
where they were both withdrawing candidates in order to increase the chances. And there were all kinds of ridings where it was, you know, 50 to 49, 51 to 49, in places where the appropriate party had withdrawn. And again, this isn't like a cure-all by any stretch, but it is interesting to see what can happen when there is some sort of strategic decision to defeat what we are being told is this incredible, you know, threat from the right.
right. And I mean, you know, it's also thinking about history, that's exactly what did not happen in the Weimar Republic, and
Right.
that led to the election of or the appointment of Hitler as chancellor. Right? I mean, the Center
Mhm.
Party famously failed to unite with the left against the right, and the
Yeah.
so yeah,
Well, I mean, and here it's like even if we did move on from Biden, it doesn't appear to me that the left would be placed in anything like a pole position or even have
no,
any
no,
type of concessions made to it, right? And so then when that candidate loses because they didn't do something like that to actually, you know, engage people that don't currently want to vote for them, um, you know, you won't have a similar result.
exactly. And the end result of that may be systemic collapse, which is my very subtle way of segueing us back to the main topic of today's episode, which is the late Bronze Age collapse. And
Mhm.
as we were joking at the top, late Bronze Age collapse has been having a moment for the last decade or so, I would say. You've never heard anything about this though, right? Like
No,
this is
no.
not something that's come across your
My
your your
desk?
your
No.
plate? You've never swung at
I
this as
haven't,
a
admittedly, I haven't, I am one of those, as you know, I'm one of those, like, I think about the Roman Empire every day
Sure, sure. Well,
bros. And
as
so, like, I also don't, I haven't really done any look in detail at anything,
before the
further
Rome.
into history. Yeah, deeper
Yeah,
into history.
yeah.
But why
Well,
don't you set up what actually the time frame and what we're actually talking about?
yeah, for sure. So the Bronze Age is one of the longest eras of sort of prehistory, the kind of edge of prehistory. We have some records from this time, but they're very spotty and they're very geographically disparate, right? I mean, some areas develop writing very early, like Egypt, Mesopotamia. Europe, not so much. So the Bronze Age traditionally starts around 3300 BCE, and it begins when people learn how to smelt bronze. Bronze is an alloy of tin and copper, right? You heat them up together, and they create a metal that can be used to make weapons, can be used to make tools.
Mhm.
And for about 2000 years, that was the best form of metal that was readily available for people. And yeah, as I say, the Bronze Age is also not, it doesn't start at the same time. This technology develops in Egypt and Mesopotamia and diffuses around the Mediterranean rather gradually, right?
Mhm.
Um, Places that are on the periphery. And we're mainly for this episode, we'll be focusing on the Mediterranean, North Africa,
Okay.
um, and Western Asia and Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, that kind of thing. And there are other developments that were happening in China and in the New World, but those are, relatively speaking, they were not in contact, as far as we know, with the people of the late Bronze Age. In any case, the Bronze Age is the first period of what we might think of as modern civilization. I mean, quite primitive by the standards of today or even the Middle Ages, but you have the emergence of cities, you have the emergence of technologies like writing, you have sustained farming, and you have kingdoms that arrive that have tens of thousands of people sometimes living within cities. Those would be the exceptions. The majority of cities, I think, around this time would max out at around, I don't know, 7 to 8, 10,000, something like that would be a huge metropolis. But there are complex trading ties, right? And we know this because archaeologists have gone through the ruins of a lot of these cities and found objects in Africa that came from Greece, objects in Mesopotamia that came from Egypt. There were
Mhm.
complex trading networks of peoples who were in contact with each other. Another big source of information about this era is shipwrecks, right? There are a number
Really?
of really interesting shipwrecks that have been discovered off the coast of modern Israel, off the coast of Anatolia, contemporary Turkey, as we must now call them. A little callback to the Euros there, but the yeah, and these shipwrecks can be dated via tree ring analysis, right? They can like actually count the rings in the trees. I'm not entirely sure how, dendrochronology, that's called, right? Where you
Okay.
use trees to date them, and a lot of them are very firmly, because when these things are first found, people are like, oh, this is probably from the Roman Empire or something, from a period we know much more about. But over time, science has increased our ability to date things, and we've realized some of these shipwrecks are from 1500 BC,
Wow.
1400 BC. Yeah, 3,000 years old, and they give a little window into what life was like, and it's complicated. There are goods on these ships that are from all over the Mediterranean. There are like these ingots of tin that are going to be used when they reach wherever the destination is to make
Mhm.
bronze, right? There are ivory, ebony, things from further south in Africa, gold. A lot of the things that we would associate with a much later time, there were already complex networks of people trading. We don't know how this was run. Was there capitalism? Probably not anything like what we have today,
Sure.
but sometimes they were under the auspices of a king or a ruler. Other times these seem to have been independent merchants of some kind. And, so what are the big civilizations we're talking about? Well, the Mycenaean Greeks are probably the most well known to the Western world because they are the people who are associated with the stories of the Trojan War, right?
Mhm.
So your Odysseus, your Achilles, right? We have no idea if any of these were historical people, but Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks in the Iliad and the Odyssey, is from Mycenae. And Mycenae is a real place. You can go there. I've been there, and it is a citadel from this era. Troy itself, Wilusa, as it was known in the ancient Hittite texts, is a real place. It was rediscovered in the late 19th century by Heinrich Schliemann, the famous archaeologist, who, like, people thought Troy was fake. They're like, oh yeah, Troy, this mythical place
Right,
the
right,
Greeks
right.
went to. And Schliemann, I think he was like a gun
You're not gonna
manufacturer.
believe this, guys.
Well, he was someone who, like, he was a kind of a crank, right? He got
Mhm.
very rich by selling arms during the American Civil War and used the rest of his life to try and, like, find the places of ancient myth. And, like, yeah, so he bought this. There was this English guy who was living in northern Anatolia on the coast, and he had this hill called Hisarlik, and Schliemann was like, "Yeah, I want to buy that." And so he did. And then he started dynamiting it. I mean, Schliemann was not what we would call a modern scientific. Schliemann
Sure.
is Schliemann is profoundly canceled by for many reasons. But, he found a big city that had been destroyed. At least, it had been rebuilt several times. Um, in Western Anatolia, like right where Troy was supposed to be,
Wow.
according to the ancient poems. And scholars are pretty much in agreement now that, yeah, that's what this is. This is Troy. And Troy is one of the places that was destroyed during the Bronze Age collapse. The other, I just mentioned the Hittites. Troy was in some relationship with the Hittites. Hittites are located in central Anatolia near Ankara, the capital of Turkey. Um, I've been there. Uh, I've been to the museum that houses all the the sort of archaeological remains of uh, Hattusha. It was a huge city, thousands and thousands of people. And as with Troy, sometime around 1200 BC, this is the end of the Bronze Age, uh, it was abandoned.
So
And
when the collapse starts to take hold, leading up to that, there was a relative peace amongst these powers. Is that right?
well, I wouldn't say peace. There were wars between these peoples. The Hittites and the Egyptians fought a major war about a
But there was also
century.
like a degree of sort of diplomacy,
There
right?
was totally,
Intermarriage.
there was definitely diplomacy. I mean, the Hittite king sent a daughter to marry Ramses II. This is like the
Mhm.
oldest peace treaty. There's this battle at this place called Kadesh, which is in modern Israel or Syria or Lebanon. It's somewhere in that sort
Yeah.
of. So the Hittites are coming up from Turkey, and they extend down into modern Syria. The Egyptians are coming from Egypt. They extend up through Israel. And their empires kind of met around this place called Kadesh. And so there was a struggle between the two sides about who would be the ruler of Kadesh, essentially.
Mhm.
And the war was inconclusive, right? At first, the Hittites were winning. Then we know about this because we have the treaties. Like, we have
We have the
the
actual peace treaty.
yeah, yeah.
Oh
It was
wow.
it was inscribed in a temple in Egypt, and we also have the Hittite version of it. It was discovered in
Oh,
Hattusha.
fascinating.
Yeah, so this is the earliest, like, diplomatic treaty that's known from history. Like,
Mhm.
it's a major thing. So yeah, you're right. But around this same area, one of the other major cities to collapse was this place called Ugarit, which is on the coast of I think it's again Syria, Lebanon, that area. And this was somewhere that had been completely forgotten to history
Mhm.
until it was excavated in the early 20th century, I believe. And we found, again, all of these clay tablets. One of the cool things is like part of the reason we know anything at all about these peoples is because these places were destroyed in fire. Because they wrote on clay primarily. They had
Okay.
a little pen and they would make their depending on the hieroglyphs, or in Greece they used a script called Linear B, which we've now deciphered. There's an older script called Linear A, which we have not deciphered.
Mhm.
We're still working on that. We have no idea what language it is. And then in Ugarit, they used a variety of cuneiform derived from earlier Mesopotamian languages that we have deciphered. So people figured out the language of Ugarit, like, and they said, "Oh, who are these people?" Well, they were another civilization that had strong mercantile ties to both the Hittites and the Egyptians. They were sending letters to the king. But when these places were destroyed by fire, all the clay tablets like got fired. You know, like when you're a kid and you like put something in the
Sure.
kiln or whatever, it gets hard. So that saved them, because otherwise the records would have just been erased and like they clear off the clay, write a new record or whatever.
Right,
But
right.
the act of destruction kind of calcifies everything, freezes everything
So
in that moment.
all of these places fell?
Well, all the
Like when,
places
when
I've
you describe the collapse, you're talking about what kind of
yeah,
amount of time?
yeah, all right, well, so I'm drawing on for this episode primarily Eric Klein's book 1177 BC, The Year
Mhm.
Civilization Collapsed, which came out I think around 10 years ago. I read it
Okay.
when it first came out. It's great. Reread it this week. And this is like one of the things you're going to have to like accept about the Bronze Age collapse is we don't know, right?
Right.
There are a lot of factors here. Um, but the three civilizations I've mentioned so far all essentially collapsed. The Hittites collapsed. There were a few Hittite city states that reformed in northern Syria, kind of southern Turkey area, but they were never again a huge empire that
And
strove from
so
the
when you say they collapse, that means that the population densities decreased, the property
dramatic,
was right, and so
dramatically.
these peoples diffused into, oh, like away from these metropolises. Is that right?
Yes, 100%. Like essentially, like in some places the population seems to have increased, and we're talking about the period from roughly 1200 BC to 1180 BC. Populations decreased
So 20
by,
years.
yeah, by up
Okay.
to 50%, right? I mean, these,
What?
yeah, like 50% of the people died. And or we don't know if they died, they left. They weren't there
Yeah.
anymore. Um, Probably a lot. In some places in the wreckage, in the ruins, there are bodies. Like they found people who were
Hmm.
like pinned under stone walls with like their feet have been burned off and stuff, like really horrible stuff. So, collapse is an important concept. Like, another great source for this is the podcaster Patrick Wyman. His show, Tides of History, a couple seasons ago, I think 2021, 2022, he did a lot of stuff on the Bronze Age. His more recent episodes are focused on the subsequent Iron Age. But he has a lot of great guests come on and talk about their research on this, and he's a very versatile historian. His area is actually, I think, Reformation Renaissance era. He has just published a book about that, but he's just like kind of omnivorous. He's very interested in the whole
Hmm.
expanse of history. Um, and he talks about this. Like some people don't like the idea of calling it a collapse because they think that's like moralizing. Like collapse implies this is bad, and as historians we should be objective or whatever. But like
Sure.
that's
What
kind
would
of
you say
ridiculous.
then?
Yeah. Dispersal or something,
Right, right, right.
um, but even in Egypt, Egypt doesn't collapse. Egypt survives. The Ugarit civilization collapses completely and is forgotten, all but forgotten. The Hittites collapse. The Mycenaeans, all of their citadels in this 20-year period are burned or destroyed.
Who
And
is doing all this? Is it just a military campaign?
no, we'll get to that in just a second. Like
Okay.
one of the main things for a long time, for the last 100 years, for say from late 1800s to the 80s and 90s of the 20th century, um, the people that were blamed for this are the sea peoples. All right.
Right.
Are you a sea people stan? Do you
I,
stan the
I
sea
did
people?
read a bit about the Sea Peoples in preparation for this, and
Yeah, what what did you get
I
from
mean
that? Like
they beat the shit out of some people in some places, right?
they
I mean,
they tortured some folks, yeah.
I mean, that was one of the things that they found, right? Was that like the level of destruction and damage to the things that did exist, the buildings, the infrastructure was incredible and whole, right?
Yeah, especially in Ugarit and uh, a couple other cities in the Levant, which is to say the area between Egypt and Anatolia. They found arrowheads in the walls.
Right.
So some of the fire was so intense that like stone was like melted essentially. Like there was an inferno that
And that's part of the idea of describing something as a collapse, right? Is that the infrastructure becomes unusable as
yeah,
well. Yeah.
absolutely. The infrastructure is completely destroyed and the entire way of life falls apart.
Right. So
Um,
what comes next is not a reformation or recalibration of what was before, right?
yeah, I mean, oftentimes, even after these terrible destructions, these sites are resettled. People come
Yeah.
back, they get away. The raiders or whoever caused this, whatever it was that caused it, is over. People come
Mhm.
back, but they don't rebuild. They don't reconstruct the palace. There isn't a new king
Yeah.
that takes over.
Okay.
It's just a more basic subsistence level of existence. And again, this is over 20 years, so it doesn't really make sense if there's like these sea peoples that just come and they like conquer Greece, they conquer Troy, no, that
Is the
didn't
idea
happen.
that they had strategic aims or were they ransacking?
It's complicated. We don't really know. So
Mhm.
the scholarly consensus is that the sea peoples are only partly responsible for the collapse. And in some cases, they had no role directly to play at all.
Okay.
Who were the sea peoples? It's a mystery. But based on their names from the Egyptian sources who recorded the battles with the sea peoples, they seem to be from places in the Western Mediterranean.
Okay.
Places like Sicily, there's the Seychelles or something like that. This Seychelles or something. There's some
Mhm.
names that are like that sounds kind of like Sicily. The Sardinia, Spain, even. And then the question becomes, well, like, why are these people from Spain and Italy coming to fight a war
Destroy these places. Yeah.
against Egypt and against the possibly against the Trojans, possibly against the Ugarit people? What do you think? What are some factors that might lead to people to leave?
I mean, for people to do that,
Yeah, like
I mean, are these like strategic locations? Are there areas that like could be of use if they were to
well, the
take them
people
over?
living there have money, they have food, they have valuable stuff that they can
Right.
take, right? But
Right.
why
So
but why would they leave where they were from?
uh scarcity perhaps?
Yeah, and what causes scarcity?
Well, wait, was this a climate disaster?
That's one of the speculations. Yeah,
Yeah.
that there was significant climate change that had a role to play in this, and it may have induced. Again, there's no one cause for this. This
Mhm.
is a systemic thing that has multiple different vectors that are affecting it. There could have been drought in Western Europe,
Right.
Spain, Italy, places like that, where there was no longer enough food for the people that were living there, and they said, you know what, we're pretty good on the boat. Got some good archers.
They're calling us the sea peoples. Let's get going.
And yeah, they just gave it a go. Now, the Sea Peoples attacked Egypt twice that we know of. The
Okay.
first time is in 1207, and they're repelled relatively easily. Not easily, but there's a battle. The pharaoh erects a monument saying the Sea Peoples
We
came.
win.
We threw
Yeah.
them back into the sea. R.I.P. them.
Yeah.
The more significant encounter occurs during the reign of Ramses III in 1177 BCE. And that's where Klein's book gets its title from.
Right.
That's the time when the Sea Peoples come back en masse to Egypt and really give Ramses III like hell of a time. He does defeat them once again, but his entire society goes into a steep decline in the aftermath of this. Now, at the same time, the
And what do you mean
Mycenaeans.
by that? Like what
This is
happened?
the this is the
Their
end.
ability to trade, their ability to
Well,
grow
yeah,
food.
exactly. The New Kingdom is called, which had started, I think, around 300 or 400. The New Kingdom is like the most prosperous period in ancient Egyptian history. This
Mhm.
is where you have your Tutankhamons. This is where you have your Akhenaten, so your Ramses the second, right? Who's
Right.
the sort of Ozymandias, the biblical, look at my work, see mighty in despair, right? Like
Mhm.
he's the kind of most famous pharaoh of them all. And this is their time. They build Abu Simbel, that huge temple where the gods are, the pharaoh like figures are the gods are sitting on carved into a massive stone cliff. Not the guys that built the pyramids, but all the other really huge, cool
Okay.
Egyptian monuments are from this era, and that stops. There's a series of relatively ineffective pharaohs, and this is, I think, the dynasty of Ramses III goes on until maybe the 1130s, 1120s, and then it's over. And this era of Egypt is over. Egypt still exists. They still have pharaohs. They still have a complex society, but it's the good days are gone. It's
Right.
like,
And these other places don't hang on like Egypt.
well, some do. One of the other empires we didn't talk about is the Assyrian Empire, which is in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, right?
Mhm.
And they also have a steep decline after this period, but they survive. Babylon, the Kassite Empire of Babylon. Now, these are places that are not affected by the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples don't go that far inland. Babylon is sacked by the Elamites, the people from modern Iran come, and they Babylon, like
Sure.
the city of cities, like the place gets just trashed by invaders from Iran. So it's not one thing. I think the general idea is that over as like one thing leads to another. These sea peoples come, they start messing places up. They seem to destroy Ugarit. They seem to destroy some of these other coastal places. One of the most controversial claims in Klein's book is that, and based on real evidence, not just supposition, the Greeks had nothing to do with the destruction of Troy. That Troy was destroyed by the sea peoples, right?
Right.
And there's a way you can, like, where does Odysseus come from? Well, Ithaca, we don't know where Ithaca was, but it's on the other side of Greece, right? It's on
Sure.
the Adriatic coast, pretty close to Italy. So if Odysseus and his men were they
Mhm.
sea peoples, some of the sea peoples could have been Greeks,
Right.
right? So maybe we can all like retcon it back in. We can fit it all together. Got to keep the Greeks destroying Troy. That's the one. It's the one pillar we've built our society around. But we don't know. It could have been sea peoples, and the Greeks could have just adopted that story as their own, right? There's other stories of like a city that was sacked because of doomed love.
Right.
Like that's an older myth that didn't start with the Greeks. Um, just like, a baby being found in the basket of reeds, like, and who becomes a great man. That didn't start with Moses, right?
Sure.
That's
Sure.
Cyrus or Sargon of Akkad told the same story about himself, in Assyria, in Mesopotamia, 1,000 years before Moses.
Mhm.
So a lot of times there's a certain amount of integration. We like that story. Actually, that story is about us. Right? Like that happens a lot across time. um so the other thing that we haven't talked about, so we mentioned climate change, definitely a factor. Scientists have determined this was during a climatic turndown, right? Could have been a variety of factors, sunspots, there are all these
Mhm.
things that we're still piecing together. Another big thing was earthquakes, right? The Mycenaeans in Greece seem to have, for 20 or 30 years in this period, even a little earlier, starting in 1250, the Mycenaeans and the Hittites, so people living in contemporary near Ankara and all across Greece, right? Because when we talk about collapse, like there are like 15 sites that were all abandoned or destroyed at around the same time, which
They
is
were all
crazy.
previously
In
relatively
Greece, just in
built
Greece,
in.
just in Greece, right?
Wow.
So like and these are people that had writing, they had complex trade, they had cities,
Mhm.
they had art. Like you can see when you go to Mycenae, which I've done, you can see the gate, and it's these beautiful carved lions that are like meeting, and their paws are like, and you walk under them, you're like, ah, that's pretty cool. Wow. And it's just been there for, 3,500 years or whatever.
Sure.
It's like untouched. Um, there were earthquakes. A lot of these places, and this is if you go to ruins in Anatolia, which I've done quite a lot of. Sometimes you'll go into a house and you'll be like, "Wow, this is really cool. The Romans lived here, or whoever," and there'll just be like a wave in the floor, like like literally, like the mosaic floor will be like undulating, and you'll be
Right.
like, "Oh, earthquake, huh?" Like an earthquake that was so severe it just like flipped the whole, and like the place was abandoned after that because it's like, oh, I can't live here, there's a wave in the floor,
Right.
like, and that's why it survives. Like, so there seems to have been an earthquake cluster, and this can happen. This is still a very earthquake heavy region, and it went on for 50 to 100 years. So if you're having earthquakes all the time, how are you going to interpret that?
Yeah, probably that you've done something wrong. You should probably get the hell out, right?
Yeah, that's a possibility, right? So it's very possible that some of these people said, "All right, that's the fifth earthquake that's knocked down the Citadel in the last decade or whatever.
Somebody's not happy with us.
Let's get in our ships and go kill the Egyptians." Like were the Mycenaeans some of the sea peoples that came? Probably. We don't know for
Mhm.
sure, but like it's possible some of these people said, "All right, this place is toast. We're getting in our boats. We're going to try to find somewhere else." Right? The gods don't like us. They're telling us
Mhm.
to leave. Again, this is all very hypothetical. What's the other factor that could have, when you hear about population decrease by 50%, what does that make you think of?
Well, I mean, there's got to be issues with food distribution.
Definitely. But what else kills people quickly?
Oh, like a good old plague.
Yeah.
Ah, well, so it was all really happening potentially.
We don't know. I mean, these are, again, we experienced COVID, as we've talked about many times.
Mhm.
COVID started in China before a couple months were up. It was in Italy. It was in New York. It was in,
Yeah.
right. Why did people carry these diseases all across the world? Because of trade, because of
Mhm.
commerce, because of tourism, right? These were complex societies that had ships coming in every day, probably into the harbor. Oh, we're here from Ugarit. Oh, cool. How's it in Ugarit? Oh, it's great. You should come. Great bathhouses. It's wonderful, wonderful dice arenas. Like, I don't know what these people did for fun. Just imagining a bunch of guys watching other guys play dice. Um,
Betting on people, betting on dice.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Betting
why
on the
not?
people betting on the dice.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah. They were coming in. They were in contact with each other. So if a plague pops up in Ugarit, they go down to Egypt. Egypt takes it down further down the Nile, down to the Sudan, the region of Nubia, maybe goes to Assyria, a couple guys on a camel, take it across the desert,
Yeah.
like there could have been a plague. Again, we don't know. It's very possible. We have no direct evidence of this. Ancient DNA is advancing. It may advance more. We may find more burial sites from this period. May see signs. Some diseases leave traces on skeletons, things like that.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's like everything kind of went wrong, and this is not a single event. It's a slow moving process where, so say the earthquakes caused, again, hypothetical, earthquakes caused Mycenaeans to give up and maybe like take to the seas and start attacking other people because they need a new place to live. They go to Ugarit, they destroy it. They go to Egypt, they get destroyed by the Egyptians, but in the process destroy a lot of Egyptians also. And they've also destroyed Ugarit, so Egypt no longer can get cedar. They can't trade. They have no one to trade their wheat to. Like it's like a domino effect. Like one thing falls, then another thing falls, and before too long, you have something that's resembling a systemic collapse, right? And
Which I guess, like, if we are in the throes of one, um, analyzing it that way might is there any chance that it's a bit of sort of confirmation bias? Like, because it seems to me that if we are in some stage of societal collapse, that it's fair to say that all of those factors are at play. In fact, I guess you would say the more complex the society, the more inevitable that any type of collapse of that society is going to be due to a whole confluence of factors, right?
Yeah, I think you want to be careful with assuming that increased complexity leads to increased likelihood of collapse, right? Because
No, not I don't mean likelihood of collapse. I'm saying that like if a society is more complex, there are just more things that are interdependent. And so in terms of like, okay, a military battle did this, right? This city fell. Then these people came to that city because of a plague or because of a climate situation, right? Um, and then something like COVID happens, right? Which sort of can exacerbate all of these political and economic tensions.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's no one thing that's going to cause our society to collapse.
Right.
There's going to be a series of things, right? And I would say we're pretty far. Despite everything, things are bad, right? We've looked at a lot of very dark visions of what the future might look like in this show. Orcs and Craig, Parable of the Sower that come to
Yeah.
mind most recently. Uh, I'm optimistic that it won't get quite that bad as quickly as it does in those books.
Sure.
I, maybe in 100 years, like long term, I'm not that bullish, but
Mhm.
we'll, we'll see. I mean, things like this
But this
French,
all of this happened in a mere 20 years.
yeah,
Right?
but
And
they
that's
had
that's
far,
assuming in a situation where things are much slower moving, right? I mean, it's a smaller geographical
yeah, and we're
territory as
talking
well.
about far fewer people too, right?
Right.
I mean, the population of the Earth at this
But
time is
that but that
probably
doesn't
like 100 million people or something.
right, but
The whole planet.
that doesn't necessarily mean it would go better because there's more of a thing, right?
No, it's true. Um, I mean, we do have some resources they did not, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we
Iron.
can. That's yeah for starters.
Hydrochloroquine, for
Yeah.
example.
Hydroxychloroquine.
Oh, is that what it's called? Yeah.
Yeah. What was the other one? Ivermectin, right?
Yeah.
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 All the good stuff. No, but I mean, we do have the possibility of responding to a pandemic in a way that these people just had
Of
no
course.
chance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't have germ theory. They had no idea why.
What was
Um,
happening?
yeah, I mean, they probably had more of an idea than we think.
Mhm.
But it was like probably on the right track, but for the wrong reasons, right?
Sure.
Like they probably noticed that when you didn't touch the person with the boils, you didn't get the boil, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
They probably didn't understand why that was, but that's, um, I mean, they were advanced. They were as advanced in terms of their brains as we are,
Right.
right? Like they were the same humans. They had, worse nutrition. They didn't have certain technological advantages, but we tend to get a little arrogant about our technology, right? Like, oh, let me just what's that? What are the symptoms? Let me just pull up my iPhone here. Oh, yeah, sorry
Right.
that
I mean, in some ways,
you
you can
have
argue that
plague.
maybe they were more advanced. I mean, if you threw me into that spot without my phone, I don't think I'd be able to build a developed society. I'll tell you that much right now.
Yeah. Now,
I wouldn't be able to make my own food.
true. Nor would I. The One of the things that's interesting, and that Klein sort of points to at the end of his book is like, all right, so you have the collapse, right? The world is gone. The world has
Mhm.
changed. And this is a world that in 500 years will have faded completely into myth and will, in fact, be the foundations of the myths that the Greeks create their classical society around, right? The
Yep.
Trojan War, no bigger event. Um, but what happens after a collapse? Like, when we think about the apocalypse, we often think about fiery doom, moments of death. The aliens come down from the sky, they nuke
Mhm.
everyone, or what have you. Um, and the fact is, people kept living. they probably kept speaking the same language. I mean, when we talk about the collapse, I just want to emphasize this. The Greeks are the most dramatic examples because they lost the ability to read and write for something around 500 years after this. So prior to 1200, there are records in a script that we've deciphered.
How does that happen?
Well, I mean, this is probably a society where literacy was extremely low, right?
Mhm.
How many people do you think could read and write in ancient
Sure.
Greece? Probably 5% of the population at
Right,
most,
okay.
right? What kind of people needed to? Priests, probably, rulers, merchants, but did even merchants probably just had to know how to count, maybe,
Mhm.
probably to some extent they did. So when you lose that ability to trade, and the other thing is, like, trade did not stop altogether. People kept going from Greece to Egypt, just at a far lower rate.
Right.
Oh, and we know this because occasionally they'll still find, in later mummies and things like this, objects that they know came from Assyria or came from Afghanistan, right? So it's like complex trade continued. It's just the level of it was massively reduced. But this is referred to in Greece, the period after the Bronze Age collapse, as the Greek Dark Ages. And it's because of that lack of reading and writing. The Greeks had to relearn to read and write from the Phoenicians, right? So the Greek alphabet that we know is actually based on the Phoenician alphabet, which we actually use, right? It's like a variation on it. So a lot of the time you look at Greek writing, you're like, oh, that's older writing than our writing. No, it's actually inspired by the writing that we use, right? The Phoenicians are the ones who invented the script that the Romans used, that we use, right? I just think it's kind of interesting to imagine a society where the ability to read and write disappears and you have to like relearn that.
Right.
Like 500 years later, you're like, we these Phoenician guys have come up from Lebanon. They've got this thing. John, have you seen this? Look. Peter, show John.
I guess it's not all Greek to them.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. It's perfect. What is the lesson to take from this, for our own society? I don't know. I think you're right though. Like, the reason Bronze Age collapse is having a moment is anxiety.
Yeah.
About our own society, about the fact that we may be headed for something similar. And
right, and that like mere complexity is not a protection against that type of end, right?
That's right. And we don't know. One other possibility we didn't mention is, like, these were palace societies. There was a king, there was a guy on top who probably hoarded a lot of the wealth and power to himself. And in some cities, only the palace is burned. The rest of the city kind of kept going.
Interesting.
What does that point towards? Is there any lessons to take for our society there? No,
couldn't be me.
But that is something they hypothesized, that some of these destructions, maybe the Sea Peoples had nothing to do with it. Maybe it was a totally internally driven revolt.
Right.
And we were talking about France at the beginning of the pod. It's a hopeful sign, that we can swing back towards a politics that at least is attempting to, if not offering a paradise on earth. I think Melanchthon says, I can't offer you a paradise on earth, but I will put an end to hell.
Right.
Which is, like, for me, the perfect slogan for this era,
Yeah, that's right.
And I think, if Joe Biden is going to stay in the race, would behoove him to, instead of just focus on the fact that Donald Trump is a criminal and January 6th is so bad, yada yada, maybe a little gesture towards the common man, towards the possibility of something to hope for.
Yeah, I'm sure it's just around the bend.
If we're looking to avoid our own collapse. Anything else you want to say about the Bronze Age collapse? I think we've done a pretty good job covering it here.
Yeah, it was great to hear.
And we have yet to decide what our episode is for next week, but
no, but we'll tease it out online.
Yeah, as we always do to our legions of fans. But whatever it is, I'm sure it will be interesting. And until then, this has been The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. and we'll talk to you real soon.